The Christmas I turned 9, my parents threw a party for 47 people. I know that number because I counted the place settings the morning before the guests arrived. 47 plates, 47 forks, and one child who had been asked to stay upstairs until the important people had finished eating. That was the year I began to understand that I was not, to my family, a person. I was a category, a line item, something to be managed and moved aside so the real business of the holidays could proceed. My name is Marlowe. I am a forensic accountant. I have spent 17 years reconstructing the financial truth of other people's lives, the hidden transfers, the shielded assets, the transactions that were designed to look like generosity, while quietly being extraction. I do this for a living because I learned early, from the people who were supposed to love me first, that the numbers never lie even when the people do. This is the story of what happened when I stopped absorbing and started auditing. Welcome back to Family Revenge Stories New, the channel where quiet people keep the receipts and family learns that boundaries have a price. If stories about dignity, documents, and consequences are your thing, drop a comment and subscribe. We're just getting started. My parents, Gerald and Constance Hartwell, were not poor. I want to be precise about that because the story they told later, the one about sacrifice and struggle, required a version of our family finances that did not match the bank records I would eventually review. My father was a civil engineer who specialized in municipal contracts. My mother ran, with considerable social skill, the image of a generous family in a mid-sized southern city where image was currency. They had a 4-bedroom house in a good neighborhood. They took vacations. They hosted. They donated to the right institutions in amounts large enough to have their names on a plaque, but small enough to maintain the posture of humility. They also had 2 other children. My older brother, Preston, and my younger sister, Diane. Preston was the firstborn son in a family where that still meant something. Diane arrived 6 years after me as what my mother called our surprise gift. And she was treated as such with the soft, indulgent attention given to things that arrive unexpectedly and are immediately beloved. I arrived in the middle. November, not December. Not a surprise. Not a firstborn. Not a gift. I arrived between 2 people who would always matter more. In a family that had already decided, in some unspoken and efficient way, what each child was for. Preston was the heir. Diane was the heart. I was the one who would be fine. I did not know I had been assigned this role. Children rarely do. I simply lived inside it. I set the table when asked. I did not cry loudly when I was sick. I kept my grades high and my complaints low, and I noticed, with the particular attention of a child who has learned to make herself invisible, how the room rearranged itself when I walked in versus when Preston or Diane did. There is a specific kind of grief that has no name because it isn't dramatic enough. It is the grief of the child who opens the cupboard and finds that every coffee mug is taken. No one stole from you. No one planned it. But there is still nothing left for you, and everyone is already drinking their coffee, and the conversation has moved on. My family ran on that kind of arithmetic. And for a very long time I let them. I left for college at 17 on a merit scholarship I had earned without their help, and I built a life in the way that people who grew up unnoticed tend to build things. Methodically, documented carefully, with no one to tell and no one waiting to hear. I married a man named Theo when I was 28. He was a structural engineer with a dry sense of humor and the habit of reading aloud from whatever book he was holding, whether or not I was in the room. We bought a modest house. We planted a garden. We were, without announcement or performance, very happy. And then my parents rediscovered me. It started, as these things often do, with a phone call in October. My mother's voice came through the speaker with its characteristic warmth, the warmth that I had spent years learning to distinguish from actual heat. She was calling to say they hoped I would come home for Christmas, that it had been too long, that the family wasn't complete without me. I wrote down the date and time of that call. October 14th, 7:22 p.m. I wrote it in the small green notebook I keep on my desk, the one I use for professional observations. I had begun keeping these notes 3 years earlier, after a pattern I will describe in a moment. At the time I told myself it was habit. Forensic accountants document. That is what we do. What I did not tell my mother on that October call was that Theo and I had, 8 months earlier, closed on a house. Not our modest house with the garden. A different house. The largest private residence in our county. A 19-room antebellum restoration on 4 acres. The kind of house that gets written up in regional architecture magazines. The kind that everyone in a mid-sized southern city knows by name. We had been quietly renovating it for 2 years. We moved in February. The county assessor's records were, of course, public. My mother had not called me in 14 months before October 14th. I said I would think about coming home for Christmas. I want to tell you about the 3 Christmases before that phone call because they are the document that explains the document. The first, I had called in early December to ask about the holiday. My mother told me they were doing just family that year. Something small and quiet. I understood. I sent gifts. I called on Christmas morning and no one answered. At 2 p.m., Diane sent a group text that included a photo of the family gathered around the tree in my parents' living room. There were 23 people in that photo. My mother was wearing the earrings I'd sent. I recognized the wrapping paper from the gifts I'd mailed. Already opened and set aside, their ribbons still curled on the floor. The second Christmas. I was not invited at all. Not excluded with a reason or an apology. Simply not included in any communication. I learned from Preston's social media that they had rented a lake house. There were 41 photos tagged with my parents' names over the course of that weekend. The third. I drove 4 hours on December 23rd after receiving an invitation that had been extended, and I mean this precisely, 12 days before the holiday. I arrived to discover that the guest room I had been assigned had been converted, sometime in the preceding year, into a craft room. A daybed had been placed against one wall. I slept on it for 2 nights. On Christmas morning, the gifts under the tree had name tags. Mine was not among them. When I mentioned it quietly to my mother, she said with genuine surprise, "Oh, we thought you were past the gift stage." I was 31 years old. I drove home on December 26th. I sat in my car in the driveway for 11 minutes. Then I went inside and opened my laptop and began creating a folder on my desktop. I named it with the date, December 26th. I placed in it the photos Diane had texted me from the lake house year screenshotted, the group text with the timestamp, the photo of the wrapping paper with the ribbons, and a note I had typed in a format I use for client files. Subject, date, observation, supporting evidence. Forensic accountants do not rely on memory. We rely on documentation. When my mother called on October 14th, I had 37 entries in that folder. I told Theo about the phone call over dinner. He was quiet for a moment, which is how he processed things. Then he said, "The house went on the assessor's website in August." He said it without inflection. He wasn't making an accusation. He was simply noting what was documented and what I already knew. I went home for Christmas. I drove down on December 22nd alone. Theo had been invited by name in my mother's subsequent calls. She mentioned him 6 times in 3 conversations, but he had a prior commitment with his own family, a prior commitment that had, coincidentally, been discovered after I told him about the house. The house my parents lived in had not changed. The wreath was the same one they'd had for years. The lights were the same pattern. But there was, when I pulled into the driveway, my mother's face in the window before I had even turned off the engine. She opened the door before I reached it. She hugged me. She said my name with a warmth that was, I will give her this, genuine in its way. She told me I looked wonderful. She asked about the house. She asked several questions about the house. How many bedrooms? What the restoration had cost? Whether we'd kept the original molding. Preston was already there with his wife and their 3 children. Diane arrived that evening with her husband. My mother had cooked the meal she always cooked. The one from the recipe card in my grandmother's handwriting. The one I had grown up watching her make. The one that meant we were all together. I sat at the table and I ate the food and I answered questions and I watched my family decide, one soft comment at a time, who I had become to them now. Preston asked 3 times about parking at the house. Whether the driveway could accommodate large gatherings. Whether we'd looked into getting a tent permit. My mother mentioned twice that the house seemed like the kind of place that would be wonderful for a Christmas gathering. Diane said, with the specific guilelessness she had always used as her instrument, "It must be so nice to finally have a home people want to come to." I set my fork down very slowly, picked it back up. I ate my dinner. After the meal, when the dishes were being cleared, Preston pulled me aside into the hallway. He had the expression he always wore when he was about to be strategic, a particular softness around the eyes that was not warmth. He said he wanted to talk to me about the future, about the family's future. He said that Dad wasn't getting any younger, and that there had been some conversations about what made sense going forward. He said he thought it would mean a lot to Mom and Dad if the family had a place to gather. A real place. He looked at me with the expression of someone offering something. I said, "What do you think Dad and Mom's estate is worth right now?" He blinked. What? Ballpark, I said. What do you think the numbers look like? He said he didn't know exactly. He said that wasn't really the point. I said, "Okay." And then I said I was going to bed. I called my attorney Vivian at 8:47 that night from my childhood bedroom, which had been, since my departure, converted into a home office. I sat on the small sofa they'd placed against the window and I told her what Preston had said, word for word. I told her what I suspected. She said she'd have the letters ready in January. If you've ever watched people who couldn't spare a single phone call suddenly find all the time in the world the moment there's a house involved, you already know where this is going. Stay with me. My father died in March. It was his heart, not sudden, not slow, but the kind of middle pace that gives everyone just enough time to feel cheated. He was 71. He died on a Tuesday morning at 6:14 a.m., in the hospital where he had been for 4 days. I was in the room. I want to be precise about that. I drove back on a Friday when the call came and I sat in that hospital for 4 days. I slept in the chair. I brought food for my mother that she forgot to eat. I spoke to 3 different doctors and took notes on their reports in my green notebook. I coordinated with the nursing staff and managed the parking situation and made the calls to the insurance carrier and the preliminary calls to the estate attorney, because someone had to and because doing things is how I had always been in my family, useful but not central. Preston arrived on day 3. He stayed for 6 hours and then returned to his family. Diane called every day. She was in the middle of something. A school performance, a work deadline, the specific geometry of another life that could not be easily rescheduled. She said she would come as soon as she could. She arrived the morning after he died. My mother held my hand in the hallway after the doctors had finished. She said, "I don't know what I would have done without you here." She said it with her whole face. I believe she meant it. 2 weeks after the funeral, I received a call from Harmon Bledsoe, my father's estate attorney, who I had identified from the paperwork in my father's study during the hospital days. He asked if I could come in for the reading of the will. I drove down on a Monday morning. I arrived at Bledsoe's office at 10 a.m. My mother was there. Preston was there with his wife. Diane was there. I had a yellow legal pad. Bledsoe had a measured voice, the kind that conveys neither warmth nor coldness, just information delivered in sequence. He opened the document and read it. My father's estate consisted of the house, currently valued at $410,000, a brokerage account with $218,000, a life insurance policy with a face value of $300,000, various personal property. The house was left to my mother for her lifetime, then to be divided equally among the 3 children. The brokerage account was to be divided 60% to Preston, 20% to Diane, 20% to me. The life insurance policy named my mother as primary beneficiary. The contingent beneficiary was Preston. The policy had been updated according to the document in January of last year. I wrote down each number. I did not look up. Then Bledsoe said there was a secondary document. A promissory note, notarized and recorded with the county clerk's office on March 3rd, 11 days before my father's death. He slid a copy across the table. The note was made out to me. It acknowledged a loan from me to my father in the amount of $47,000, issued across 7 transactions between 2016 and 2022. It listed each transaction with its date and amount. It stated that the note carried 3% annual interest. It stated that repayment was owed from the estate before any other distributions. I looked at those numbers. I had sent that money across 6 years. Tuition money for Diane's second graduate degree, which my parents had asked me to help cover because they were stretched thin. Emergency home repairs on 2 occasions. A medical procedure for my mother in 2019 that insurance had partially declined. Preston's business once, when he needed a bridge loan that he had described as temporary. My father had kept every transaction. He had recorded them. He had, 11 days before he died, made them legal. I looked at the note for a long time. I turned it over. There was nothing on the back. I turned it face up again and read it once more from the beginning. At the bottom, in a handwriting I recognized as my father's, was a handwritten line below the notary seal. It read, "She was always counting. I should have been." I pressed my palm flat on the table. I did not look up until I had finished reading the entire document 3 more times. Preston said, "What is that?" Bledsoe said it was a recorded promissory note and was enforceable against the estate. Preston said, "Where did that come from?" I said, "From your father." The letter came 2 days later, the one Vivian had prepared. It went to Preston, to Diane, and to my mother's address. It was 4 pages. It detailed the promissory note, the interest accrued, and the total amount owed, $51,340. It stated that this amount was to be paid before any other estate distributions, per the terms of the recorded instrument. It attached a copy of the note. It attached supporting documentation for each of the 7 transactions, wire confirmations, email requests, text message chains in which my father and Preston, and in 2 cases my mother, had asked for the money. It also attached as an exhibit 43 screenshots from my folder. Dated. Time-stamped. Labeled. Preston called me within the hour. His voice was doing something I had not heard it do before. It was unsteady. He said the letter was aggressive. He said this wasn't what Dad would have wanted. He said the family was grieving and this was not the time. I said, "When is the time?" He said, "You can't do this to Mom." I said, "The note is your father's document, Preston, not mine." He said the 20% split was unfair given everything, given what he had contributed. I let the silence sit for a moment and then I said, "Send me a list of your contributions with dates and amounts and I will look at it." He did not send a list. 3 weeks after the letter went out, Diane called me. Her voice was different from Preston's. It had the quality of someone who has been crying and wants you to know it without saying so. She said she didn't know about the loans. She said she hadn't known what it cost me. She said, "The grad school money, I thought Mom and Dad." I said, "I know." She was quiet. I said, "You didn't know." "That's true." She asked what was going to happen. I told her the legal process would proceed and then it would be over. She asked if we were okay. I said we were. I did not say it warmly. I did not say it coldly. I said it the way you say a true thing when you are not yet sure what it means. The night before the second gathering, the one my mother called to invite me to in April, the one she described as a chance to talk things through as a family, I sat at the desk in my home office, which is a room in a house with 19 rooms, and I opened the folder on my desktop. I printed the 43 entries. I put them in a manila folder. I put the promissory note on top. I put the folder in my bag. I went to bed and I slept for 7 hours. My mother's house in April was the same house it had always been. The forsythia by the front walk was blooming. I arrived at 1 p.m. Preston's car was in the driveway. Diane's too. My mother answered the door. She was wearing the expression she reserved for important occasions. Alert, poised, the expression that said she was conducting something. She hugged me. She said she was glad I came. We sat in the living room. My mother had put out coffee and the cheese and crackers she served at every formal gathering. Preston sat next to his wife. Diane sat across from him. I sat in the chair nearest the door. My mother began. She said she wanted us to be a family. She said she knew things had been strained and she understood I had some concerns, but she wanted us to remember what Dad would have wanted. She said Dad would have wanted peace. She said Dad always said the family was the only thing that mattered. Preston said, "We just think the letter was it was aggressive, Marlo. At a time like this." His wife nodded. My mother said she thought, given everything, that perhaps there was a way to handle this quietly. That perhaps I might consider just letting it go. For the family. I said, "Tell me what you think the family has given me in the last 5 years." My mother blinked. I said, "I'm asking genuinely. I want to know what you think the exchange has been." Preston said this wasn't about keeping score. I said, "I'm a forensic accountant. Keeping score is literally my profession." I said it without heat. I said it the way you state the hour. Then I opened my folder. "I want to tell you how quiet that room was." I said, "I'm going to go through a few things." I took out the promissory note first. I set it on the coffee table and I named it, what it was, who had signed it, when it had been recorded. I said, "Dad made this legal 11 days before he died. He had access to an attorney. He was of sound mind. The hospital records will confirm that." I slid the note toward the center of the table. I did not pick it up again. Then I took out the wire transfer confirmations. 7 of them in chronological order. I read the dates and amounts aloud. I named what each one was for. Preston said, "We paid some of that back." I said, "No, you didn't." I took out the bank statements. I said, "If you have a record of a repayment I don't have, I'd like to see it." He did not have a record. I took out the screenshots. I did not read them all. I selected 6. I read them aloud. The text from my mother in 2019 asking me to help with the medical bill. "You've always been so steady, sweetheart, we hate to ask." The email from Preston in 2020 asking for the bridge loan. "This is temporary, just need a few months." The group text from Christmas 2021, the one with the lake house photos, timestamp 3:47 p.m. from Diane, sent to a group that did not include me. Preston's wife started to say something. Preston touched her arm. My mother said very quietly, "Marlo, we didn't mean." I said, "I know you didn't mean to. I don't think you thought about it at all." I said it without volume. That's the part I've been sitting with. Diane's eyes were wet. She wasn't looking at Preston. She was looking at her hands. I said, "I'm not here to punish anyone." I pulled out the last document. "I'm here because Dad left me a clear record of what was owed, and I intend to honor his wishes." I set down the last item. A photocopy of the handwritten line at the bottom of the promissory note. Just that line enlarged on a single sheet of paper. She was always counting. I should have been. Preston looked at it. His jaw moved. I said, "The estate will process according to the recorded instrument. That's not negotiable and it's not personal. It's your father's legal document." I put everything back in the folder. Closed it. I picked up my coffee cup. I took a sip. I set it down. I said, "I love this family. I have spent 37 years proving that. I have a folder with the documentation." I stood up. "I'll see you at the distribution." My mother said, "Don't go." I stopped. Diane said very quietly, "She's right to go, Mom." No one said anything for a moment. I picked up my bag. I said to my mother, "I'll call you next week." I meant it. "We'll have dinner." And then I left. The estate closed in July. The promissory note was satisfied from the brokerage account before any distribution was made. $51,340, plus accrued interest, transferred to my account on July 9th. The remaining brokerage funds were distributed per the will. The house passed to my mother. Preston did not speak to me for 4 months. He called in November. He said he'd been thinking. He said he thought he owed me a direct conversation. We had it. It was short and it was honest, and it did not change history, but it changed something smaller, the specific texture of the silence between us. That is not forgiveness. It is not absolution. It is simply the first real thing we had said to each other in our adult lives. Diane and I have dinner every few months. She asks questions now, not the soft inherited questions of someone performing connection, but the kind that require a real answer. She is learning to count. I find I don't mind teaching her. My mother and I have dinner on the second Thursday of every month. She does not ask about the house anymore. She sometimes mentions my father in the middle of a sentence, unexpectedly, and then goes quiet. I let her be quiet. I have learned that this is something I can give her. The 43 entries in my desktop folder. I moved them to an external drive. I do not open them. I don't need to. But I have not deleted them because I am a forensic accountant, and we do not destroy documents. We archive them. The promissory note, the original, sits in my filing cabinet in a sleeve marked with my father's name and the year he died. I have read the handwritten line at the bottom of it 4 times since July. The last time I read it, I did not need to. With $30,000 of the repaid funds, I established a scholarship at the university I had attended on merit, the one I had gotten to without help, the one that had been the first place I was counted. The scholarship goes to a first-generation student in accounting or finance who demonstrates financial need. I named it after my father. He was not a perfect man. He was a man who, in the end, with 11 days left, got the accounting right. There is a difference between revenge and correction. Revenge requires an audience. Correction requires only a ledger and a willingness to close out the column that was never supposed to be open. My family confused my calm for surrender for 37 years. Calm is not surrender. It is the stillest water before the final calculation. If this story reminded you that every transaction has a record, that quiet people tend to keep the most careful files, and that boundaries are allowed even with the people who are supposed to love you first, take that with you. Check what you've been absorbing. Update what needs updating. Close the accounts that were never meant to be open. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.